But reason and evidence does not hold sway. Just look at the skeptic community and their views on race and IQ.
I'm not a scientist, I'm not an anthropologist, etc. And I would so much prefer for actual scientists to talk about this stuff.
Race realism is kind of just common sense.
Thank you, because your lecture touched my genes, and I know the genes of everyone in here.
I'm just trying to understand the nature of reality. As a comment I read the other day pointed out, people confuse scientific findings with a political or social agenda.
RK selection theory.
The people who deny race realism, or the fact that IQ varies depending on race or background, they're just being timid PC pussies.
It might be a lot if we're talking about a group that seems naturally inclined to socialism like Hispanics do, but, it's nothing.
Denial, 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 obfuscate, obfuscate, obfuscate. And when they finally lose the debate, they say, well, but let's say that it's true. What does it matter?
Let us continue. At the start of this, just as initially done in my last video, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the two academics, a geneticist and a neurologist, who have sacrificed time out of their packed schedules to help me understand theories of biology which a layman like me initially didn't understand. Thank you very much for your time and effort. In the last video, we found out that the alt-right really has absolutely no clue how sexual reproduction works, proclaiming in essence that you can separate a sexual reproduction strategy from the sexual reproductive organs that have evolved to necessitate such strategy, and that the alt-right seems to have a rather skewed understanding of evolution, claiming that sexual reproduction strategies that have evolved over hundreds of millions of years can be randomly reassigned to people they disagree with. In this video, we will find more evidence to show that the alt-right is too dumb to understand evolution, even on a rather basic level. The topic being race realism on the basis of categorizing races as biological categories. There are many videos on the matter that we will discuss today, most incoherent and lame, so I decided to do what I did with the last video and go directly to the source of most of them. Interestingly enough, the source itself was often linked to me by various alt-righters in conversation. It's the Alternative Hypothesis, which is a white nationalist site run by two individuals with an accompanying YouTube channel hosting podcasts and posting videos on various issues frequently discussed by the alt-right. And of course, amongst all of them, you will find race realism. It's one of the favorite topics, defending and going after anyone who critiques that idea, and many alt-right talking heads that you have seen appearing throughout YouTube seem to directly quote the articles from the Alternative Hypothesis. For this video and its topic, we will however stick to one specific post or article to which I have frequently been linked to, which I believe many within the alt-right use as a main source, and which I found the Alternative Hypothesis frequently cited and quoted within his own video titled The Existence of Race. The article happens to start with something rather funny. Majority view. Quote, theoretically, we shouldn't be concerned with what the majority of experts think about a topic. We should simply be able to rely purely on our own evaluation of the facts. But in reality, nobody has enough time for that, and they use expert opinion on various topics as heuristic for the correct position on that topic. And one common argument against race is that the experts recognize that race doesn't exist. So in essence, I don't believe in asking experts such as biologists to explain biology, but it is also worthwhile asking experts like biologists to explain biology. This is a fascinating statement, truly. But yeah, good. I guess the author of this article did as I did and sought out biologists to ask them for their opinions on the subject matter of race realism, and no, they did not. Anne Morning looked at the usage of race in 80 most commonly used high school biology textbooks from 1952 to 2002. While not as good as a survey of biologists, it gives us a rough indication of the trend in biology, which, unlike asking biologists to explain biology, literally is an appeal to authority fallacy. But anyway, the Alternative Hypothesis at least links to this study, so we can read it ourselves. Wait, this is just the homepage of the Sociology Department of the New York University. What does sociology have to do with classifications in biology? Okay, I am being admittedly a bit cheeky here. Bottom line, I couldn't find the original study. All I could find was a book by Anne Morning, which I didn't buy, since, as far as I have seen, it is purely sociological and has absolutely nothing to do with biology. But I remain charitable that this statistic is correct, that medical description of race has risen. So I did what the Alternative Hypothesis should have done. I asked a neurologist why the medical descriptions of race have risen in biology and medical textbooks. And the answer is all rather simple, because it has all to do with the word medical.
There are good scientific reasons to use the term race or ethnicity in a medical context. It is actually pretty simple, but not for the reasons some of you might think. Yes, it has to do with different geographical locations, which led to different selection pressures on different continental populations. Let me illustrate this with an often used example: sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia, or sickle cell disease, is a genetic disorder found in the hemoglobin gene which results in an abnormality in the structure of red blood cells. This disease gets its name from the sickle-like shape of the affected red blood cells. Sickle cell anemia causes many medical problems in people that have two abnormal copies of the hemoglobin gene. However, a person who inherits only one abnormal copy of this gene carries the so-called sickle cell trait, which means that they are heterozygous at this specific gene location. They therefore have a functional and a dysfunctional copy of the hemoglobin gene. A person with this genotype produces both normal and abnormal red blood cells. As a result, they do not display the severe symptoms of sickle cell anemia like patients with the homozygous hemoglobin gene, but since some of the red blood cells show the unique sickle-like shape, they are actually somewhat resistant to malaria. Malaria is a mosquito-borne infectious disease which is caused by parasites, in more detail single-celled microorganisms of the Plasmodium type. These microorganisms infect liver and blood cells of humans in order to reproduce. If a person is a sickle cell trait carrier, some of his or her red blood cells are basically immune to infection by these microorganisms because of their unique shape, and therefore show less severe symptoms of malaria if they are bitten by an infected mosquito. In an environment with high risk of malaria infection, this leads to a selective evolutionary advantage and causes this heterozygous gene location to spread within the specific continental population. As the Wikipedia article on sickle cell trait states, sickle cell trait provides a survival advantage over people with normal hemoglobin in regions where malaria is endemic. The trait is known to cause significantly fewer deaths due to malaria, especially when Plasmodium falciparum is the causative organism. This is a prime example of natural selection, evident by the fact that the geographical distribution of the gene for hemoglobin S and the distribution of malaria in Africa virtually overlap. Because of the unique survival advantage, people with the trait become increasingly numerous as the number of malaria-infected people increases. So, what can we learn from this? As soon as specific genetic and environmental factors overlap in a geographical region, the local population will adapt to the selective pressures. This can happen pretty quickly in regards to certain diseases because there's a direct causal link between having a certain trait and becoming more resistant or even immune to an infection or a disease. Stated simply, if you have a trait that makes you more resistant to a disease, you are more likely to reproduce successfully. As a result, your genome will spread farther in the population. However, this does not allow us to extrapolate this fact in order to claim that there are other traits that might or might not differ between continental populations, especially when they are not just dependent on one gene that shows a difference, like the heterozygous hemoglobin gene in the case of sickle cell trait. Intelligence, or IQ, comes to mind, which all of you alt-writers and race realists love to bring up every time in current political discussions. Listen. At least 52 genes are tied to intelligence and IQ, but it's pretty likely that there are many more genes involved. There's no data and no scientific reason which would allow us to equate the trait intelligence with a trait like sickle-like shape of red blood cells, but this will be a topic for another day and another video. When we are talking about medical predispositions and overall vulnerability to diseases, the causation is pretty clear. Most of the time. Since different continental populations developed under different environmental factors, doctors and other medical staff have to be aware of this fact in order to provide effective medicine and treatment. It is actually pretty similar to the difference between men and women. Not all treatments show the same effectiveness if you use them on women or men. But of course, there's a really big caveat to all of this. Let's have a look at the publication, population profiling and public health risk. When and how should we use race or ethnicity? Which illustrates perfectly why it is not that easy or even warranted to use race or ethnicity as a criterion to categorize people, even in the context of medical treatment. The author George Allison writes, setting aside for a moment the debate about what race or ethnicity means, be this a biological, social or political aspect of group identity, it is still pertinent to ask whether it can be reliably measured. At first sight, race or ethnicity appears inherently unreliable. There is little consensus on what race or ethnicity means or on how it should be defined and measured. First of all, Race or ethnicity is a construct and not something that can be easily or reliably measured with objective criteria. There are no clear definitions on where racial boundaries start and end. Therefore, even in medical context, self-assigned race or ethnicity is the most commonly used technique in order to measure this trait. If there's a need to explain to you why this, and by this I mean using this as an argument for the existence or reality of race, puts you in a pretty bad position, there's actually no point in trying to save you intellectually.
Stop it. Get some help.
But let's carry on. It is more difficult to set aside the contested meaning of race or ethnicity to discuss its reliability as a proxy for other variables. In part, this is because, as we have already seen, there is no universally accepted definition of the term. But this is also because race or ethnicity is associated with a wide range of biological and social variables, and because its use as a measure and a proxy for either can lead to stereotyping and discrimination. So, even if we accept the unclear definition of race or ethnicity and try to use it as a proxy for medical relevant variables, we arrive at the next big problem. These categories are not purely biological. They also have a great social dimension to it. And again, this further complicates the matter and leads doctors, physicians, and other medical staff to be extremely cautious when using self-assigned race as a criterion for medical assessment. Given the association between race or ethnicity and a range of biological and social variables, its use as a proxy for both seems entirely pragmatic. However, the multiple uses of race or ethnicity generate a confused picture of what the term actually means. Using race or ethnicity as an analytical tool also reflects an assumption, or at least creates the impression that the differences between the groups are distinct, the groups are relatively homogeneous, and the biological, social, or biosocial differences are an essential ingredient, if not a determinant, of group identity. While these assumptions might hold true for some characteristics of some categories in some contexts, they do not hold true for most characteristics of most categories in most contexts. Another important point. Groups based on descriptions of race or ethnicity, so-called continental populations, do not show distinct differences, they are not homogeneous, and there is a big overlap between populations. Therefore, the author writes, using race or ethnicity as a proxy variable or collecting data on race is only acceptable when there are no better alternatives and when the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. As we can see now, even in a medical context, the use of race or ethnicity is strongly debated and highly controversial. There are great barriers for medical personnel to use race as a data point because it is neither reliably measurable nor reliably predictive of other variables. So, just a quick hint. I would not recommend using the rise of medical descriptions of race in biology textbooks as an argument for anything, if you do not even know why and when it's utilized in the first place and what caveats are attached to its modern application.
Vielen Dank für die Erklärung. This section continues, and rather than providing us with any kind of scientific finding from an academic biological standpoint, all we get is in essence surveys on the use of words that are incorrectly then branded as surveys of opinion, with several more survey after survey after survey on the use of terms rather than any kind of opinion paper, let alone an biology paper. As interesting as you may or may not find this, Alternative Hypothesis never clarifies what he means by race in the initial pages of this piece. And more importantly, he never clarifies what these papers mean by the use of the term race, or how the term race is defined in these sociological papers. The only study he cites which you can actually view yourself when clicking the source link is one on the use of racial categories by Chinese scientists, and defines racial categories as, quote, racial categories as defined here include traditional racial taxa, astroloids, self-contradictory geographical descriptions, Australian Europeans, ethnical identifications, inferred by the researcher by just looking at the people, and any groupings in terms of supposed historical origin rather than observable characteristics. Now, let's make this very clear. These are not biological categories. These are not biologists categorizing people on the basis of there being a supposed scientific theory of race within biology. These are all sociological categories. traditional racial taxa, sociological, self-contradictory geographical descriptions such as Australian, European, that's sociological, unless you can prove to me that there is a biological category of Australians. Ethnic identifications inferred by the researcher by just looking at people groupings in terms of supposed historical origins rather than observable characteristic. Yeah, that's also sociological. None of these are in any way biology. None of these are in any way natural science. This entire first segment of the article, titled Majority View, besides being a lame appeal to authority, is nothing but something that we have found in the last video too. Sociological determinism masquerading as biological determinism. With that over with, let's move on to the next part of this piece, heterozygosity. Heterozygosity, or gene diversity, is a measurement of genetic variation within natural population groups. A gene is a segment of your DNA responsible for various parts of who you are. Take, for example, your hair color, which is as it is because of a specific gene. That gene contains the information similar to a building plan that creates the proteins responsible for your hair color. And the variation of these genes amongst the population group are what causes varying hair colors within a population group. These variations are called alleles. With hair color, the alleles would be the different genes for the different hair colors of brown, blonde, red, and other. Heterozygosity measures how many of these alleles exist within a population group. High heterozygosity means more alleles, hence more genetic variation. Low heterozygosity means less alleles, hence less genetic variation. And heterozygosity can tell you a great deal about not only the structure but also the history of the measured population. For example, very low heterozygosity of cheetahs shows the severe effect of small population sizes, bottlenecks that reduce the amount of genetic variation relative to what we would usually expect to be found in comparable mammals. Now, with the term explained, let us dive into what the alternative hypothesis has to say about it. Quote, one popular argument used against the possibility of races in humans is that humans are 99.9% the same. This claim was first made by Craig Venter in 2000. However, in 2007, Venter did another analysis that showed that only 99.5% of human chromosomal DNA is the same between two random individuals. Despite this, it is still a popular talking point amongst race deniers that humans are 99.9% the same. Now, quote, humans are the same is a rather weird way of saying it. It doesn't really make much sense. So I will just quote directly from the article that the alternative hypothesis uses here as a source. Quote, if you ask what percentage of your genes is reflected in your external appearance, the basis by which we talk about race, the answer seems to be in the range of 0.01%, said Dr. Harold P. Freeman, the Chief Executive President and Director of Surgery at North General Hospital in Manhattan, who has studied the issue of biology and race. This is a very, very minimal reflection of your genetic makeup. The criteria that people use for race are based entirely on external features that we are programmed to recognize, he said. And the reason why we're programmed to recognize them is that it's vitally important to our species that each of us be able to distinguish one individual from the next. Our whole social structure is based on visual cues, and we've been programmed to recognize them and to recognize individuals. So in essence, the source alternative hypothesis gives doesn't say we are the same, but that the genes responsible for what we perceive as race are merely 0.01% of our genetic makeup. That is not the same. But now, in relation to that, we get to the really fascinating stuff. Alternative hypothesis provides us with a set of statistics of data groups comparing the heterozygosity of various different species, meaning the genetic diversity measured between variant different species of animals. And this here is really funny, since on the right side of this data set, alternative hypothesis adds a table with all the known subspecies of those species. He then proceeds under the next part of genetic clusteredness to do the exact same thing, providing a table listing the FST distances in species with a table of recognized subspecies that he added right next to it. The argument he is making here is that higher heterozygosity, meaning higher diversity in genetic makeup in a population group, means that there will be more subspecies. And consequently, he is arguing that there is a biological concept of race for human beings, which is subspecies, or that the various races we find amongst the human species are subspecies. So yeah, races, according to the alternative hypothesis, are subspecies. And I'm going to take my sweet long time explaining to you in detail how unbelievably stupid what he has done here is. These stats have namely absolutely nothing to do with each other. Sweet fuck all. Heterozygosity, which is genetic variation within one species, has absolutely no correlation, absolutely nothing to do with supposed frequency of subspecies. What the alternative hypothesis is doing here would be called a spurious relationship. To explain what a spurious relationship is, I will give its most famous example. Robert Matthews' storks deliver babies. Within this paper, which is intended to show what a spurious relationship is, Robert Matthews collected the data of stork populations from various nations, as well as data of the human birth rates of these nations. He puts these data sets next to each other and showed that they correlate mathematically, meaning in correspondence to rising birth rates in countries, you will also find rising stork populations within those countries, and can mockingly proclaim that rising stork populations are responsible for rising birth rates amongst people. This, of course, is nonsense, because even though there is a mathematical correlation, there's absolutely no correlation in reality. A nation's birth rates are not dependent upon the nation's stork population. The correlation, as can be seen in the graph of the two data sets, is purely mathematical with no basis in reality. And this is what the alternative hypothesis would be doing here. Yes, I'm saying would be, because he's failing. He takes two sets of data which have absolutely nothing to do with each other and then pretends that they are in biological correlation, when in actual reality they are absolutely not. The number of subspecies is not dependent upon the genetic diversity of a species. There's absolutely no empirical data whatsoever that would prove that genetic diversity causes an increase of subspecies. There are zero scientific biology papers showing such a correlation. There's absolutely no foundation for it besides a supposed mathematical correlation. So in essence, alternative hypothesis pulled all of this out of his arse. Not only that, I can actually show you, without a shadow of a doubt, that there is no correlation, meaning there's not even a mathematical correlation. When you take the previous example of stork population and human birth rates, you will see that at the very least there's a mathematical correlation, as shown within the graph, where the data is applied. That mathematical correlation gives us the illusion of there being an actual correlation. So allow me to give alternative hypothesis and the alt-right, who seem to have slept through their mathematics lessons in school, a brief lesson in 7th grade high school mathematics. So here we have 5 coordinate systems with x and y axis. On them we have different points scattered amongst them at varying locations of each coordinate system. Now the Pearson correlation coefficient r determines whether or not there is correlation or not. However, we can also do this visually without showing the actual calculations. If we connect all the scattered dots and get a straight rising line like this, r is 1 and there is correlation. If we connect all the scattered dots and get a straight falling line, we get r is -1 and there is correlation. If we connect the dots and find, however, that there is no straight line and r is less than 1, like 0.8, or more than -1, like -0.8, that would mean that there is progressively less correlation until we hit 0. If r is between 0 and 0.5 and -0.5, there is close to no correlation. If r is between 0.5 and 0.9 and -0.5 and -0.9, there is some more likelihood of correlation. And when r is 0, there is no correlation. So in essence, the straighter the line, the more likely there is to be correlation, unless the line wouldn't rise. Then we have certainty of there being no correlation. Now let's take all that data that the alternative hypothesis provides here for heterozygosity and the frequency of subspecies and put them into a coordinate system. After all, the argument that the alternative hypothesis makes is that there is a biological correlation of increase in subspecies with increase in genetic diversity. There's absolutely zero empirical data or any biology papers which would support that, but if what he says is true, we should find at the very least that there is a mathematical correlation, meaning we should receive a correlation coefficient of r is 1, r is -1, or r ranges from 0.5 to 0.9, or r ranges from -0.5 to -0.9. And the graph made out of this data would be a steadily rising or steadily declining graph. Well, you tell me what that looks like. According to the alternative hypothesis, the source of many alt-righters making claims of race realism on the basis of biological categorizations, this is a straight line. R is 0.08, meaning there is almost certainly no correlation. Let's take the second set of data of FST distances and subspecies and put them into a graph as well. And again, R is 0.41, hence almost no correlation. The alternative hypothesis slammed together statistics thinking he would be creating a statistical correlation, which in itself would have been a fallacy since this would have been a spurious relationship. Only scientific biology papers could have proved that correlation, yet he didn't even manage to create that illusion of a correlation because there isn't even a mathematical correlation between these data sets. This entire thing is nothing but pure hogwash, nonsense, absolutely pathetic, and you can debunk it with 7th grade high school maths. Trying to prove something through attempting to make up an irrelevant correlation mathematically, and even failing at creating that mathematical correlation. The only thing that would have proven that an increased genetic diversity or heterozygosity is responsible for an increase in subspecies would have been hard scientific data, not from mathematicians, not from sociologists, and not from anthropologists, but from biologists. This here proves absolutely nothing, even if there were a mathematical correlation. I know from doing this research that an increase of genetic diversity within a species increases its chances of succeeding within the process of natural selection, meaning it's more adaptable, but there is absolutely zero evidence for any correlation between an increase in genetic diversity within a species and a correlating increase in subspecies. This entire segment is nonsense on that basis alone. What makes it worse is that the alternative hypothesis and the alt-right is trying to sell you this nonsense on the basis of a spurious relationship, in essence an illusion, and they even fail at creating that illusion. But finally, for the end of this, we still have to stick to this pathetic attempt at trying to create a spurious relationship and failing, however for different reasons. Because what the alternative hypothesis is in essence implying here is that human races are subspecies. This is something that I have frequently heard from by the alt-right, and it is mainly a claim that underlines one thing, that the alt-right does not understand evolution. The animal that the alt-right really likes to take for their argument are the Sumatran tigers, at least that's what I heard from Tara McCarthy, presumably after she googled subspecies, came to the Wikipedia article on subspecies and found the Sumatran tiger listed there as an example within the English Wikipedia article as an example of a subspecies. Well, I don't need such a special example to prove them wrong. I just need the donkey, a subspecies of the horse. Why is that such a good example? Because you can famously mate a donkey with a horse and the result is the mule. The mule is a F1 hybrid, the offspring of two different subspecies, but far more relevant to us because it is well known that the mule cannot produce offspring. If human races were different subspecies, they wouldn't be able to breed. If human races were subspecies and were to have sex and produce offspring, there is a possibility of there being offspring, yet that offspring would be sterile, impotent, and incapable of producing viable offspring, just like the mule. I do not believe I need to explain how this is nonsense. It should be common knowledge that interracial offspring is very well capable of producing offspring. If they couldn't, the human species would have encountered an evolutionary dead end right after leaving Africa. Every single 23andMe gene test that revealed Asian, Native American, or African ancestry rebukes the alt-right idea that races can be categorized as a subspecies on the basis of genetic diversity. The thing that the alt-right seems to ignore consistently is the mere simple fact that the criteria by which biologists separate different species is sexual reproduction. If an animal evolves to a point that it can no longer reproduce with whatever animal it evolved from, it is a new species. Different human races can interbreed. There are mixed-race children, and those mixed-race children are capable of producing offspring. Therefore, from a biological standpoint, the idea that races are subspecies is simply false. But what the alternative hypothesis thinks of the science of biology and its classifications is revealed within the last segment of this article. Quote, "One tactic of race denial is to get really hard up on some super explicit definition of race. Races are obviously just populations of people geographically separated that interbred and thus are genetically and physically distinguishable. That's obviously true and all you need. And we should be able to just go forward and talk about the genetic differences between these races." The only denial here is the alt-right's denial of science. There's a very good reason why biologists do not engage in wishy-washy definition games and have clear-cut criteria for what they categorize as what. There is a very good reason why, for example, biology uses sexual reproduction as its criteria of what is a species and what is not. Either they produce viable offspring that isn't an evolutionary dead end, or they do not. There is no murky grey line, no room for statistical or other random overlap in a natural science such as biology. There are only clear-cut and simple black and white yes or no answer criteria. Because biology is about being clear-cut, on the point, and precise. If biology were to stray away from that criteria, it would end up within a mess. For if we start categorizing on the basis of random criteria, and they are called random because of overlapping potential, then we end up with no clear rules and a mess. If we start categorizing population groups, for example, within biology by their height, we start getting statistical overlaps between population groups, rendering that categorization pointless. If biology starts categorizing people on the basis of strength, we start to get statistical overlap with other population groups, again rendering that categorization pointless. If we start categorizing people into biological subcategories on the basis of their intelligence, we end up with a statistical overlap, hence again rendering such a category as useless. And this is why sexual reproduction is the criteria by which biologists categorize species, because there is absolutely zero statistical or other overlap. You either produce viable offspring or you are an evolutionary dead end. We have not yet discussed the alt-right's talking points on race and IQ, but within this context it serves a great purpose as an example. If you categorize on the basis of intelligence per racial group every single black person with above average IQ, this proves your criteria of categorization along the lines of intelligence, because it would, according to that criteria, suddenly turn an above average intelligence black person into a white person. Like stated before, there is no room within a natural science like biology, which is based on empirical evidence and falsifiability, for nonsensical, wishy-washy overlapping nonsense. In the next video, I intended to talk about the alt-right's talking points on race and IQ. However, since there have been a few laughable responses to my recent videos, I'm considering responding to some of those first. Not entirely sure yet. Maybe you can let me know what you would prefer in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share on Twitter, maybe even become a patron or make a one-time donation via PayPal. Links to my PayPal, Patreon and Twitter will be in the description.